Nyeba gunle namdol shin yunde gunge gemba bu simjen gunge nye jigun hamje genla gunjan omen jege gen podan ne dusum sange gunge ngowo ni ransumen chego ngasuman denze be sawe lame shabla sawa ne dambichu nyamsulembi kulon sangbo ni chungki sambatang janchubki simdang tempe koni dambichu nyamsulembar shus.
Firstly, give rise to the motivation that in the context of practicing the sublime Dharma, you're wishing to give rise to the mind of renunciation and to the mind of bodhicitta. And with those two aspects of motivation in mind, please listen to the Dharma and practice.
Tani danganzo lamki rimba shibi kaplare de nani tani lamki ngowo dame tobi Sherap sini de kola shibi shugure.
So now we are talking about the path and the stages of the path. When we're talking about the path, we can describe its essence, what makes the path the path. And among those, we currently are talking about the wisdom that recognizes the absence of the self, that recognizes selflessness.
Dela chidang tani chekin gansa ke dame dan cheki dame sini niye penani dangaranzo 당보 연립디 방콕이 여바 인도 연립디 뽕어제 발라 대중사디다 강사긴 다진디 차디기 여바 인도 아니 데 릭베게 다제다니 강사긴 다메디 몰로곰 강사긴 다메디 곰셰나 데니 쉐기 다메디 rikpa kochung tabare tini lela buchini gomto kare tindi ba indu tang tordu na lamki ngowo dame tobe ki Sherap tini rangyule kepe cheto la tini kansakin dame di jekum chedangi kola shugyo. Tene kansa ke dame di jekum je yundu chidang ribiko kashi chi yebinane ta kapsun baba nanzu chik ndu deki rikpa la tene kansa ke dame jekum chidang kordi shugyo.
So the reasonings, we're talking about reasonings in the context of analytical meditation. We're using rationality to come to the conclusion of selflessness, right? Currently, we're talking about out of the two kinds of selflessness. There's the selflessness of the individual versus the selflessness of all phenomena. The reasoning that refutes the self of the individual and the self of phenomena are very similar. But it's easier for us in the beginning when we're doing this meditation, this analytical meditation, to first approach the reasonings that have to do with the individual. So the essence of the path, what we're trying to do is give rise to the mind which recognizes, or the wisdom that recognizes the absence of the self. And eventually we can use this similar reasoning to give rise to the selflessness of all phenomena. But first, in order to do that, we start with the selflessness of the individual.
Tadeyang Dordina Maranzu Gansak ki Dazingi Zimba Nashingi Dalji Yobayina Dini Dashi Pumbu Ngale Yana Chikdu Suldu Dubkobam Yokobatang Yana Dele Tadebam Dumitsuldu Yokoba Yimba Kanshikla Da Ribeki Cheba Jeyongdu Deni Chiki Tsuldu Dubayinayang Ngoye Nisultang Tungimebatang Tadebam Dumitsuldu Dubayinayang Ngoye Nisultang Tungimebachi Sebachayongore.
In brief, we do this by applying reasonings. So first we have to recognize what we're working with. Essentially, there's clinging, there's apprehension, there's a mistaken mind which apprehends the self of the individual. But the question is does that self exist in the way that we cling to it? So we can ask, and we can explore this by asking, okay, what is the basis of our clinging? What are we basing this clinging on? What's the foundation? What's the support for this clinging? It's the 5 aggregates. And we can ask 2 questions. Is it the case that the self of the individual is the same as the 5 aggregates, or is it in some way different or multiple, separated somehow from the 5 aggregates? So it's through this process of analytical reasoning, rationality, that we approach the recognition that it's neither the case, that clinging to the self as being identical to the 5 aggregates does not accord with reality. It's not the way, it can't be that way. It's not in harmony with the way things are. And then it's the same when we ask, is it the case, is it in accord with reality that we were to cling to the self based on the aggregates as something different than those aggregates? And again, we come to the conclusion that that's not the way reality actually is. That's not how things are in truth. And so we come to the conclusion that it is impossible for there to be self of the self of the individual being either identical to the 5 aggregates or different from the 5 aggregates.
Tadi cha yongdu teni da thame ki ngaranzula ki kwe ki ngishe dawati karresana dagdu zimba sadi dengi tengdula tenjekin da mebala ani le pan dota waresha seji dorduna teni dagzindi ngui nisultang tumbeki loji maimbar 출밤 로그시에바지 예 삼비 마나줄라다 삼로데스 니시키 연구래.
Okay. So it becomes clear when we engage in this analytical approach to whether or not the self exists or not. And the goal at last, what is it that we gain from that? It's certainty. It is a confidence that, in fact, the self does not exist in the way that we cling to it. So, again, it's this clinging to a self. It is not based in reality. And because we've approached it rationally, we do not find a self. There's not a self that exists in the way that we cling to it. And so the conclusion of that realization is that we recognize that the mind that clings to a self is false. It's pure, it's a mere label. It's an exaggeration of the truth. It's just a pure label of that we attach to the five aggregates. It's nothing more than that. So we recognize that this clinging to a self is not based in reality, and that clinging itself is purely just a mistaken mind. And when we have confidence in that, that's called gaining certainty.
가수바베게 리파딘 줄라테니 다니 딩이셰데다 당보 고와서실레 디니 아니 미티니 거미온데니 녀와당 똑발라서 바른 바시노치니 타마 아니 랑귤라 다메 세디다 다세디 문인 다니 민두 선베 고와점지 마인바 녀와당 똑바든지 랑귤레 끼에서 바이나 아니 다메 또베 셰랍데 랑귤레 끼바이는스니 다 tendes samutang kugare.
So in the beginning, when we're working with these reasonings, the goal is to give rise to this certainty, this confidence. In the beginning, it's an intellectual understanding of the conclusion of our analysis. But when we continue and we continue with the meditation, we continue with the practice, what then occurs is the aspects of experience. We begin to actually experience that for its truth. Then, after that, the next step is to actually gain realization. So we have this conceptual understanding, followed by experience, followed by realization. And so ultimately the goal is that we have complete, utter confidence that really, okay, there is no self. So again, it begins with just an intellectual understanding. And then slowly, as we keep practicing, we'll find that we have experience of that, and then eventually realization. And this realization we call the wisdom that recognizes the absence of the self.
Tandelatini kasang ni shi sini rimbadela yebinani ta kakjange ba nedetang tini kyabange bi ne seti shibare tini rikbangwe dilada Chigdang dalviki rikpatang dumedang dalviki rikpasni niyere. Ta denane khasang chigdang dalviki rikpasa din dekola shubikabre.
In our previous classes, we have talked about the 4 kinds of certainty that are required when engaging with this practice of analytical meditation. First is the certainty of recognizing what it is to be, what we need to be refuting. What is that? What is it that must be refuted? So we gain recognition or certainty in what that exactly is. Then the next step is to have certainty in what are the limits of possibility. What are the ground rules, the guidelines for coming to approaching this rationally. And so we've talked about those at length in previous classes, and now we've come to the actual reasonings themselves. The first being the reasoning or the certainty that recognizes that the self is free from being single or one. And the fourth, or the second reasoning is that we gain certainty in that the self is free from being multiple or many or separate. So it's through these two actual reasonings that we're at now. In our previous talk, we went through the reasoning that recognizes that the self is free from being one.
다 직당 달베 리과디 dordyna 풍부다 다디 직 이래담 말에도 스니 따지 땅바 텔라세기요레 드니 풍부다 다 니부디 직이 줄도 둡나 아니 왜 니술다 딘데진이 투구면도 제자 풍부다 다 니부디 직 말에도 스니 리베텐라 파파들라 아니 직당 달와 순거요레
So the two reasonings that recognize that the self is free from being either one or many. In brief, as we talked about in our last class, we ask whether or not this self is similar or identical to the five aggregates. We ask this question: is it the case that the self that I cling to is identical with the five aggregates? And we investigate whether or not this is true. Then we come to the conclusion, well, if it is the case that the self that I cling to is identical to the five aggregates, then there are a lot of problems that come with that. It's not, it conflicts with how things truly are. And we come to the conclusion that it is not the case. It can't be the case that the self is identical with the five aggregates or the aggregates in any way that we categorize them. So that's what we call the reasoning, which is the freedom from singularity.
다 델라드니 고미용도 림바드라고들라 숨라고 지 배제 샤죠 그래 지당기 검단지 이제 아니 되게 낭세더니 아주 레레지는 고매지 있으니 다 대나네 가산 지당 고매스리다 아주 다진기 다디 진용도 다 간데시 증결해서나 아니지 gyurme 그 딱바라고 지 아니 지 두마 뒤샤파 마인바 지고라고 지 아니 대안지 조디다 네 지기에 네 통기도 네 초르기도 삼베게 만라주기 믹당 왕보당 감당 끼제라소바기 내가 제샤고 마인바 네 장왕기 군이 내가 지기에 삼베게 당아주 사와포함 제바포함 용화포라고 지 대안되니 지 나랑기 가레 삼바나 신지 여고도 삼베게 지 라완징이 삼로지 슈춤 보인 거라 봐.
So on top of this general approach to the analytical investigation of the self being whether or not it is singular to the five aggregates, through this process of meditation and analysis, we have a general approach to how we do this, and we have there's kind of a particular way that we can look at this relationship between the self and the five aggregates. We can approach it by three ways. So we ask the question, okay, I have this clinging to a self, but how is it that I cling to the self? How do I do that? How do I think of the self, and how do I cling to it? And firstly, we think of it as something that's pretty much unchanging. We could call it permanent, but there's this sense of continuity of the self, and that it's unchanging in a sense. We have the impression that the self is not multiple kinds of things. We think that it's a singular identity. We don't normally cling to it as something that's more than just one thing. Then we have the impression that it is us that are. We think, okay, it's it's me that's feeling, it's me that's seeing, it's me that's experiencing things. It's not. We're not automatically thinking that, oh, it's my eye that's doing the seeing. We don't think it's these faculties that are doing the thing. We don't think it's a collection of the different kinds of dhatus or the elements that is having these experiences, or that it's the sense faculties or the sense sources that is doing this experiencing. We have the impression that it's us. We are doing it. So we see the self as being the experiencer, the one, the actor, the agent, the one that's having all these experiences. We find that it's self-contained in a way, that it's us that are doing these things, not something else. So we apprehend the self as being having these three kinds of characteristics.
남주의 나라조다 다진기 신두도 신유든 다도 그네질 신두고래. 다 계시 풍부디 다기나 되니 율라 제바지 용되다 만주 풍부디니 두메 라신지래 메다베 라신지래 아니 라왕 말이 시왕게 라신지래 풍부 깨바디야 시왕래 아니 나란스 풍부 왕볼라소베 율라 주바디야 시왕진지래 타마가바디야 시왕진지 임바인디 다 풍부기 챙이되다 아니 다기 챙이니부디 베드코랑 송기메바다 가와차되기 여바인디 아니 풍부디 다 말해도 계시 풍부딘다 이나 아니 다데야 미다바 임바다 두마 임바다 시완진지 임바지 차두고도 스니다 덴데기 가와 주베코니 삼로타데 강달 아니 풍부 나레 삼비 짐비짐바디 아니 탁발라 툴니 둘레 삼비 지마나신지 출발해샤 삽니다 삼로 코르토바이나 다딩아주 다 풍부니 찍도 마주베기 되니 제검제당 당보디 자그래.
So normally, it's through these ways that we cling to the self. So the self is the object that we're apprehending, and we're doing it through these three kinds of perceptions, or thinking that it has these three kinds of characteristics. But then we ask ourselves, well, if it is the case that the self is identical to the five aggregates, then there are things that we have to there are implications of that. Firstly, when we think of the five aggregates, or the aggregates in general, we find them to be multiple. There's more than one. We find them to be changing. They're impermanent. And we find them to be conditioned, that it's based on outer or other circumstances that they either engage or disengage with the world around them. For example, when we apprehend an object, when the aggregates themselves apprehend an object, it's due to outer conditions, things outside themselves. And when that connection or that apprehension is stopped, it is also based on outer conditions. So essentially, it's not it's not autonomous in itself. It's due to the coming and going of outer circumstances that it exists. So when we think about what defines the self versus what defines the aggregates, they're completely contradictory. So when we come to that conclusion that it just can't be the case that these are the same things, that we come to this recognition, okay, the self is not singular, not identical with the five aggregates. Because if it were, the self would also have to be multiple, impermanent, and conditioned on other. So we think about this. We give this some time for us to really contemplate it, and then we recognize, okay, this clinging to the self is just like the example of clinging to or apprehending a rope to be a snake. It's completely a delusion. It's a mistaken mind. It's not the way things actually are. So when we come to this conclusion that, okay, clinging to the self is like clinging to a snake, then that's what we talk about that's what we mean by gaining recognition or certainty that the self is free from being singular with the five aggregates.
Tadini diki nangsela maranzu gomjap gomyongdu ta phungbu nga yorite inaya phungbu nga de chun dordina lusemi se nala duyung korwa suki chakyoba semgi chakyoba ta suk se ko bembore duldu tube rashin chenchire maranzu Sherap sem se ta ko nyamsu nyongwe tsengi che da sari ki dangi chin cha de gore ta di re la dini yang ngaranzu cheba cheni gom ku gore ta di ni nangse ki gom ta de la sum ra bo chore tangbo di ni subudi sim redu maridu sini da do sini cheba che di chigre.
So again, within that, we can approach this through different ways. There are different angles that we can come at this question, this analytical approach. For example, we have these five aggregates, but we can subsume them into two categories. We can categorize them as being either body or mind. So we can take the five aggregates and say, okay, we can shorten that list to make it the aggregate of the physical form and the aggregate of the mental mind. The aggregate of form is material. It's matter. It's made when we talk about matter, we say that it's made of particles, material particles. And it includes things like the flesh and the blood. When we talk about the mind, we define it as something that is that which experiences. It has the qualities of being clear and knowing, or cognizant and knowing. So that's how we define these two kinds of aggregates. And so when we're meditating, we can approach this question of singular or multiple by looking at it through this angle as well.
니바디드니 셈디드니 다 레도 마레도 게시 셈데 다 임바이나 아니 뭐에니 술당 퉁고도 퉁고민도 스니 제바제디 니바데레 다 숨바델라드니 양 아란솔라 수부당 셈니 레레네다 다 마르테 이네양 코나니 추 루당 샤바이나 데 다차도 그래 삼바도지 너디나다 르당 셈니게 촉바디 아니 나인 삼비 삼바지 용 시바레 용거여레 다데 아니 촉바 르셈게 촉바디 다 이나 뭐에니 술당 퉁고도 퉁고민도 us니다 디 제바타디니 낭세기라고 시래도와 심 다레도 말해도 수부 다레도 말해도 데니기 초바된 다레도 말해도 스네 제바지인 거래 다대 숨간 나네야 다들 많이 봐이나 데니 다들 많이 봐라
So it's through these through these two these categories of form versus or material form of the body and versus the mental mind. We can kind of go in a step-by-step approach to whether or not the self is either one of these or a collection of them. First, we can ask, is it the case that the mind is the body? We can ask that question first. Is the mind the body? Secondly, we can ask, well, is the mind the self? Right? And when we ask these questions, if it's true that one of these is correct, then does it conflict with how the way things are? Is it in harmony or is it in disharmony with the way things are? So we can ask that question. We can also ask, it's also possible for us to ask the question, well, maybe it's the case that it's the combined collection of mind and body that makes the self. It's this collection, this aggregate of both physical and mental aggregates that we cling to as the self, or in fact is the self. And if that's the case, we have to again ask ourselves, well, is that in accord with the way things are, or does that contradict the way things are? So first, we can also ask, well, again, simply, is the mind the self? Is the body the self? Or is it the collection of these two things that is the self? And if it's neither of those three options, then we come to the conclusion that that's the limit of possibility, right? So is there any other possibility within these two categories? No. And so if there's no other possible way, then we come to the conclusion that the self does not exist as either of these possibilities.
다 지당 당보 아주 수부디드니 다레도 마레도 아니 아주 다진디기 진용도 수부 코랑 다임바 증기도 증기민도스 다 강달 dorduina ngaranso dakjingi jimbi jindangki dedang deni ngoye nisungiri tungu gore de tunsomaina da dakjindi matulbe shebaji dan yandabaji charu gore ko demba charu gore deni da dadu jimbiki jindang dedang yul ngoye nisuni boti matun songayambaina 다 되니 디기 가래 라트 연구요 그래서나 다도 짐바디 출발해샤 삼백이 되니 라트 연구요 tunda nega tawo de dire.
Again, when we think of ourselves, I, me, if it is the case that this self, this me, is identical with the physical body, and we cling to the self as being the physical body, then there are a lot of problems that come with that, right? And because it contradicts the way that we actually cling to the self, cling to myself, we have to come to the conclusion that that is not the way the self would exist. Yeah, we cannot say that it is accurate for us to cling to the self as being identical with the body. It's that would just be a very confused, misguided assumption or apprehension to make. Again, and the best way to clarify that is because when we say I, there's a difference between saying I and my, right? When we relate to the body, we're always saying my body. When we relate to ourselves, we always say I, yeah? So there's a clear separation between me and mine. And when we recognize that, we can come to the conclusion that the self, if it were to exist, it could not exist by being identical to the physical body.
Teni da dangbo subudi ngayin sambadawaji yungu yobayina. Teni dakzingi jindangdi subudi nga re sini jingidwe sinsu la yanchi kazan gongdo shubana shi nga zu dakzing korang la tekar madawa chini surni chikpa tagu kudo ba. Ta nga zu subudi ngayin sambaji jing yongdo yang jingi mare kandi shini jingi mare sana nga zu di nge lakpa yi di nge kangba yi di nge subu re sini subu di dakzingi chik chashe chi yinpa dawa chi mato dak se di gyablo dewa le chi subu le ta deba yoba chi nga zu zingi dowa ta di nga na zu susu ki dakzing korang la do chini gyablo ni deba yi na sebo tongare nga zu go nawe kapsula nge go na ki doks nge kangpa cha songs rwa nge sini nga se chi gyablo deba yoba dawa che ta nga na zu ki dini sugi pungbo di chashe kare yoba ini ya tamje di digi chi long checha dawa tang wang gyurcha dawa chi ingen che dila wang kengi chi dadin gyablo la yobe su dawa chi zingire mato kangpa lakwa tang subu kona nga yin sambe nga zu namji zingi mare ta dordi na kare re subu di nga yin na teni dazingi subu rang ngar zingo ba kanshi la te mazin bar chene dazingi ngair zimba yingo yoba indi ani subu diya talashana digimido ba wanda didu sini cheba chego gore ngare sini labuduwe zingiduwe nge sini zingidu ani subu le 타디에베 지 나지 여바 시샤 다워스토니 나주 아니 소스 수고된줄라 심바티 쇼용 것도 봐.
So in addition to that, clinging to the self as being identical to the physical body comes with a lot of problems. Another problem we can talk about is, or identify, is that the fact that when we talk about me, we apprehend it as something that is clear and knowing, that is the knower, the experiencer of things, right? In contrast, we apprehend the physical body as purely being material. It's just matter, right? The matter in the sense that materialistic matter. And what do we mean by that? It's that it's not the thing that thinks. It's not the thing that experiences. It's not the thing that feels. Because that's left to, we normally cling to that which feels and knows and experiences as me, as we identify with that. We identify with the experiencer, the feeler. And so these are again ways that clinging to or apprehending the body versus apprehending the mind are contradictory. Again, we have this feeling that we're the actors in experiencing, we're the actors in feeling our world around us. But if it were the case that the self is identical with the body, because that body is purely just material, it's purely just matter, unthinking matter, then that would contradict the way that we perceive ourselves, perceive or cling to the self, because we cling to the self as being something that is knowing and aware, and the body, purely just the body, as something that is inert and material and unthinking. Right. So again, we can find that there's a contradiction in how we see these two different aggregates.
다 내가 난신기 셴바양 꽤 망보여래. 가르에서는 땅아주 나세데 거지 사리기 당이 시행 하고 게 디도 용해지래도 와. 땅아주 수구세데 거 변보러 봐. 거든데 지 시에투긴다 또투긴다 용투긴 초투긴가 라신지 말해. 근데 나디다 남중아주 네 시기요 네 용수 네 초송선이 초비게 당이 전제래도 와. 내 인바인도 야 수부디기시 나이나 아니 나디 시행 저렇게 용해 인바 간식라 수부세에다고 뱀베랑신 인바인도 셰바사리기 차이요 말해. 네개야 되게요 말해. 등급인도 와 뭐에 니수다 되니부디. 다 내가 난신기 되니 나란주기 남길 진단들래야 나이께니 단다보도 나디 균마치니 찍바인 딩겨라 와 용거여라 와 당안주 수부디 지금 망보진 제두거래 와 샤타기 수기 풍부디 아 된줄라 상도 땅바이네 야 나란주기 다징기 진비 진단 찍인 삼바데다 나란주기 수부디 딱고 망보지 잽니 카가 차차와라 와 대니버디한 퉁겨요 말해 다 간다르 된데지니다 삼로 망보지 땅용도 수부디 나인 수부딘다 있나 되니 뭐에 니술당 메팀바 망보 준거 여바당 되니 다 진기 진용도 수부 마인 바지니 수부기 지파 갑종 되발라 유현다고지 진디기 여바인도 니 수디야 다 말에도 삼바질라 아주 니식 깨도 그래.
Additionally, when we apprehend the self, when we think about the self or relate to the self, we have the feeling that since I was born until now, the basic sense of self is unchanged, right? We find that it's singular in being something that since our birth until now has not changed. In contrast, the way that the body changes, it's very clear that we can see that our bodies have changed since our birth, right? And it's constantly in flux, and we apprehend it as being that way, correct? Right? Our physical flesh and blood body is always changing. And so if we do cling to the self as being identical to it, right? Then we would have to accept that the mind, or that the self, that our apprehension of the self changes in the same way that the body does. And because that's just not how we apprehend the self, ourselves, myself, then we have to come to the conclusion that that's not the way, that we cannot conclude that the self is identical with the physical body. Again, because when we cling to the self versus cling to the body, right? We see that that the self is somehow behind, is more than or separated from the body. When we say my body, right? There's an aspect of separation between the two, that leads us to the conclusion that if the self does exist, it cannot be equated with the body, because there are so many contradictions of how we perceive these two things. So then we gain the certainty and recognition and confidence that, okay, it's true. The self exists. It cannot be identical to the physical body.
다 내가 난신 이바디드니 당 하나 아주 선바디 ngare베스니 딜라 선호 당고거래 다 단지단 찍바래 더그래 선바디양 nga스니 샤나 양의 니순다 퉁고요 말에 진단되다 닥증기 진단되다 가르치는 퉁고요 말에서나 아주 니셈셀라 그러와 Nye sem na song, nye sem la po song se chi, ma do nga sem se ni nga ju nam ju do san do kogu me do ba, da zing gi zing yong do. Da de ji do yang ji dak se di nga ju gi tul yong do zing yong do, sem ba de le yang gyab lo de wa le chi, nga se gen ji yo ba che, ani sem ba di nye ji cha she yi be so da ba ji, den de ji la zing yong do ba. Temado ani kisi sembarang ngai na ngasem selagu mado nge sini kece tu yunggu yo mare.
So the second analysis concerns the mind. First, we had the category of physical body, and now we have the category or the collection known as the mental mind. So we ask the question: okay, is the self identical with the mind? And it's essentially the same reasoning as we had with the body. And we approach it by saying, okay, is the way that I apprehend the mind and the way that I apprehend myself or the self, are they non-contradictory? Do they work together? And we can come to the conclusion that they contradict each other, just like clinging to the body does. And why is that? When we relate to the mind, we also again say my mind, right? We say, oh, that really hurt my mind, or that really affected my mind. We approach the mind the same way that we do with the body. So again, when we cling to the self, we feel that behind the mind there is the owner of the mind. There is a self that it goes beyond, that is separated somehow from the mind, that possesses the mind. Right? The mind becomes an aspect of the self through this basic recognition, or this basic apprehension of the mind as being something that the self owns, or is a part of the self, right? Because we don't say I am mind, right? We normally say my mind, right? So so the question is the self my mind? Well, because again, we've gone, there's this separation between me and mine. We have to say, in the same way that we did with the aggregate of the form, no, there's something behind it that is different. So we're not actually apprehending the self as being identical with the mind.
다 내가 난신기 나 만족이 셈세디 코 두메라신 젠지레 깨직깨직란 규드베라신 젠지레 코 상하승이 망부지레 다 베나가라주 셰발라 차샤와나 가라주레 왕셰당 이셰당 믹셰당 나셰 셰바 망부지요레 아니 셰바 관한 수수수수기 질리든조 카가카가레 내가 난신기 남도 찔러서는 당바에네 남도 nga마 치마치마 끼 연구를 사와사와 연구를 봐 근데 임바인데 다 나라주기 나세디 근데 말아 나라주다 단다바도 나 대가랑이 직바이 삼는다 도르디나 남도 두마레라 남도디 미다바 규베라 신전시 차디게 요바레 되니 나세디 근데 말아 나징기 율기 교도비 신유도 교베 나세디 거지 gyurme chikpa yinba dende chik lola sha yungu yoba yindu tenya semdang semse diyang ngala ngosin cheba yina ngoye niru dang tungu yomare la zindang de dang tungu yomare.
So again, when we think about my mind, right, this mind that we experience is not a singular thing. There's lots of different kinds of mind, right? It's always changing, moment by moment, second by second. The mind's racing through all different kinds of thoughts, having thoughts come and go, right? We can think of all kinds of things. When we talk about the mind itself, there's many kinds of mind. We can say that there's the different kinds of mind of the different sense faculties, like the eye consciousness or the ear consciousness, the mind consciousness or the mental consciousness. And each of those different kinds of consciousnesses have their own individual function, their own things that they cling to, etc., etc. When then we talk about kind of the stuff of the mind, right? We can talk about thoughts, namtok in Tibetan, right? There's different kinds of thoughts. They're coming, they're going, right? There's always a new proliferation of thoughts coming second by second. But when we think about the self, when we think about me, we don't think about it in that same way, right? We feel that the very basic idea of self has been the same, or is basically unchanging since our birth. But in contrast, there's so many different kinds of thoughts. The stuff of the mind is always changing. There's so many kinds of thoughts. Versus the way that we think of ourselves, which is a kind of an unchanging, basically the same throughout all of those mind events, right? So the way to cling to the self as being identical to the mind, it contradicts how we experience those two things.
다 되기더니 다도 신에니 삼보다용도 셈바디 나샤와이나 아니 나르징기 진당대당 셈기 ngowoki kejel라서 같은 주 퉁기메바인디 아니 셈바데야 nga 마레도 삼비게다 삼보지 아주 당투거래.
So we contemplate this, right? We think, okay, if it is the case that the self is the same thing as the mind, what are the implications, right? Is that in accord with reality, how I apprehend those two different things? And we come to the conclusion, yeah, the essence, the basic, what makes the mind, right? The essence of the mind is in direct contradiction to how to the self in the way that we cling to it, right? It's in contradiction to the way that we cling to the self. So because these two things cannot be in accord with each other, then we have to say that, okay, the self is not the mind.
다데니 숨바디 아나솔라다 류당 셈레레니 nga main 지 류심리파 초용되더니 안디 nga 차도사래 nga레도가 스니 나 덴데기 지 삼복 용식을 봐 너가 용식을 다디치당 딜라 삼로당당 니여레 삼로당당 찍디 마란수 가래 댕겨서는 촉바 세죠로 봐 촉바 세지 촉바 세 코랑되더니 가래레 스다 단지 류다 레레니 마레스는 아주 다 쳐서로 봐 다양 코니가 냠도 좀 용되더니 나레 세지 너가 용거 여봐이나 다디 리심기 촉바들에서 이거 봐 지당니 촉바 세디 ngalashana digiyo mare karechini digiyo mare sana chokpa sedi ko tayore penanga ju mi mangbo zombala tini mi ki chokpa seda wada shingnang shin re mangbo zomba dele shingnang sene pa ming ta sha parwa ngwe nisula taje tang de kapsula ani chokpa sedi susu kin jedala teni le dota kwa zamshire mato cheki 문에 다니게데 신동 레레라파 신나세데 가와도스는 제가 침바이나 니가 말아봐 배낭아란수 픽셀 망보 좀 용도 값을라다 픽처 세디 차두거 봐 더 픽처 세디 픽셀 망보 속샤 발라티는 딱베 뢰근도 딱바실 마도 원니 픽셀 세데 가와도스네 파 줌인지니 지 떼바이나 아니 니기야 말해 다 디게 가리 땡겨여서나 촉바 세디 뢰 도다 잠지를 마도 뇌 내술게 땡돌라 두바메바지 차되게요 와 다 대차되디 만수 나스는 진용대 값을 딘데게 진단게 윤리 교병하디 딱 봐와 말와 운이지라와 두바지래 랑신기 두바지래 제사한다 촉바세디 나의 삼바디 촉바니 따외 임바간실라 나디 운이 임바다 지 두바 임바니 버디 몇 가와차 되게 여바인데 아니 촉바세디야 디기요 말해
So the third option is that the self is a combination, and itself an aggregate of the body and the mind. We can certainly have that kind of question, right? Because we said, okay, it cannot be identical with just the body, and it cannot be identical with just the mind. But what about the collection of those two things together? Well, first we have to ask, well, what do we mean by this collection, this group? We came to the conclusion that the self is neither the body or the mind. But what about together? This collection of body and mind. Well, a collection cannot be equated, or the self cannot be equated with a mere collection of things. And why do I say that? Because a mere collection of things is itself just an imputation. It's a mere imputation. It doesn't actually exist. And how can I say that, right? For example, a group of people, right? There's many people, and we say, and we impute onto those many people, individuals, a group, a group of people. Same thing about a forest, right? A forest is nothing other than many kinds of trees. But when we actually go and try to find the forest, right, all we find is trees. Just like when we try to find a group of people, all we find is just people. We don't find the group. We don't find the forest itself, because it's merely an imputation. So a group is, all it is just an imputed label based on individuals, right? It's a mentally constructed idea. It itself does not actually exist. Because when we try to go find that aggregate or find that group, we don't find anything. Same thing with a picture, right? So like a digital image. A digital image is made of pixels, right? And we imbue onto that collection of pixels the idea of a picture. Oh, there's a picture there. But when we zoom in, right, all we find is pixels, right? We don't find the picture, right? We don't find the image itself. So in the same way, if the self is equated with a collection, what are we saying? We're saying that if that's the case, well, does that contradict with how we relate to the self? No, because when we think about the self, we think it actually exists. We're not thinking that it's just a mere imputation, right? We actually think that it's there, that it's real, that it's something very much more than a mere imputation, right? So when we consider what we mean by aggregate or a collection of two or more things, it completely contradicts the way that we relate to the self. So in that way, again, clinging to the self as being identical with a collection of body and mind doesn't work.
다 되니 김신 찍리다 아주 류당 셈니보디 레레니 나 마임바 룹시니 아니 양자 콘정이 추 초니 아니 나세 직 샤투벨라 김신 가야메 바차로 그래 송바래 당 아주 빼디 제 제마 짜니 말짜니 메행기 제마디 레레게 나라 말 메바 마투바 임바 송사 다 제마 망보지 초샤바이네 딜 말 용고 말에 스님 빼든데 샤나도 봐.
So another reason that we can apply, or another kind of approach to this question, is that firstly, we said that okay, the self can't be the mind, and the self can't be the physical body. We've eliminated those two options, but still, then after the fact, we think, oh, what if the self is a collection of those two things, right? Okay, that doesn't make sense, right? For example, if we don't have something in the beginning, how can we say that we have something later, right? If we don't have say butter, but then we have it in a later time. Well, in the beginning it wasn't there in the first place. So how can after the fact we can say that, oh, now we have something, we have a collection of objects? It just doesn't work. It doesn't make sense.
다 대단신 나랑수 남주 배는 미지기 시송와 있네요. 되니 아주 미로딜라 지당 풍부된주다 갈라간섬지 고 초대여와 이내는 다코 미디 요마리 시사와레스 비서마 코지 시작이랑 신전실마도 딜랑 아주 미래에서니 주구주구 말이 증기 말와 나 풍부 지당 거랑 그 초바쌈지다 간사들의 여대와 근데 이제 딱 강들 풍부기 초바세에 대한 나래 삼바디 아니 등의 내술다 마팀바지 차도 그래 스님다도 스님 타마데 초바디 anga 말에도 삼베기더니 리베기 때나 팜니 데간라도 스님더니 셈데 샤바이나 다디니 지금 차도 그래.
We can think about the example of, say, when someone passes away, right? When that person passes away, what they leave behind is merely a corpse, right? It's just a heap of aggregates. It's a collection of things. We say once they've died, they're no longer there, right? The person is kind of gone. All that's left is just, say, the flesh, right? And we don't then on that impute the presence of a person, right? They've already died. So when we can think about that example, right? That's how we normally think about it, right? So in the same thing, this collection of the body, or this collection of aggregates, we on top of that impute some kind of this kind of an individual, right? And so, but that's not the way that things are, because it's just a mere. Because what we impute is we impute as it being just a mere collection of things, and because a mere collection of things doesn't truly exist, it's just a mere imputation, right? So to think that the self is somehow identical with a collection of the body and the collection of the mind, it contradicts the way that we apprehend or perceive the self. And so it's through this application of reasoning that we come to some confidence. And when we kind of come to that confidence, then it's on top of that we practice this analytical meditation.
라서 다 드링 도르디나 아주 직단 달비기 리과스 해야될 지단기 리과 직단 난세기 리과 숨 더버지 아주 검고고도 와다 지단기 리과디 게시 풍보단 다 니버디 찍이나 아니 다 누마타와다 아니 미다바타와라서와 드니차 두고디 신당다 둥금매바인디 외니순다 되게민도 세제 아니 난세 레레 거명되더니 셈디 수부 짱바디더니 다그래도 말해도 그래서 있나 다생기 신당다 둥금도 둥금민도 생다야지 니바디더니 셈디다 다 레도 말해도 그래서 셈디 다이나 다생기 신당다 둥금도 둥금민도 생다야지 되니 숨바디다 류당 셈니가기 초바디 다인 산비기 진비 남도도 여나 내안되니 왜 니술다 퉁고도 퉁고민도 으스니다 다제 땅에디 다다 풍부 찍도 마트비게 되니 다 검갸빙 겹단게 낭세게 되니 남바 숨다버지 차되게 요사레스
about the reasoning of the self being free from being either singular or are identical or separate from the aggregates. We talked about it in a general sense, a general application of that reasoning, and then later a more particular or more specific application of that reasoning. In general, we say that if the self is identical with the five aggregates, it would necessarily imply that the self is multiple and the self is impermanent, right? And that contradicts the way that we perceive the self. We perceive it as something that's stable and singular, right? In particular, we approach the same question by saying, okay, if the self is identical with the form aggregate, or with the form aggregate or the physical body, is that in a line with how I perceive the self? So we ask that question. Same thing, is the self identical to the mind? Would that be in line with how we perceive the self? So we question that. And then the third option is the self identical with the collection of these two, the physical body and the mental mind? Because that's also a possibility, right? So then we ask, okay, well, but if that's true, does that really, is that in harmony? Does that not contradict the way that I cling to the self? And so it's through this general and particular way of going about this analytical reasoning that we come to the conclusion that it's not possible for the self to exist as being identical to the five aggregates in general, and to either the form or mental aggregate or a collection of the form and mental aggregates.
그래서 janchu semjo rinpoche magye banam gekyureje geba nyambara meba gone gondo pelvare sho